Just a few brief comments about our next speaker, Rex Deighton-Smith. He's an independent consultant. You've got the bio notes there. The point I'd just emphasise, he's got quite deep experience in the OECD and looking at things from an international perspective, and was involved in some quite path-breaking work that the OECD did in terms of regulatory governance and setting in place conceptual models and frameworks and best practice principles that have been quite widely used throughout the OECD area since then. And I've sort of inherited some of the mechanisms in my role as chair of the Regulatory Policy Committee at the OECD. So thanks for that, Rex. He's also had an academic role at Monash University and lectured in that centre's Master Regulatory Studies degree program. So over to you, Rex Deighton-Smith.
Well, good morning, and thanks for that introduction, Gary. I'm certainly very pleased to be attending my first ever ANZSOG conference, and so I'd like to thank Gary for the invitation to attend and to speak to you this morning. The presentations on day one will certainly have a very high standard, and I hope I can come close to maintaining that. I'd like to address the topic of this session at a fairly high level, and to begin by offering a definition of the term better regulation, before attempting some assessment of whether this policy has been delivering on its promise, and then identifying a few problem areas and indicating how we might try to address them to improve the performance of our better regulation agenda. Obviously, at a basic level, regulatory change and improvement is a constant. For as long as governments have been using regulation as a widespread tool of policy, they've been constantly seeking to change, modify and improve it. But when we talk about there being a better regulation agenda, we clearly mean something a little different. And I think the OECD has quite a good definition, which is that better regulation refers to conscious whole of government efforts to improve understanding of the nature of regulation as a tool of government and to increase the effectiveness of that tool. And so the underlying objective of better regulation is to improve welfare in the broad sense in which economists use that term. What does better regulation involve? It's important to understand that there's about a 35-year history now in the implementation of the better regulation agenda. And so our understanding of what it entails, and indeed what it can entail, has evolved quite substantially over that period of time. The OECD, as Gary suggested, has been deeply involved in this area of policy over much of that period, and there's a substantial body of published work on this subject which documents that evolution. And that work is informed in part by a series of more than 25 country reviews which have assessed the regulatory systems in place in member countries and the reform programs that they've adopted, and attempted to make targeted recommendations for enhancing and improving those programs and those regulation-making structures. There's been an evolution in the terminology we use to describe the better regulation agenda over this time. If you read this body of OECD work, you see initially there's a lot of discussion of deregulation, which quite quickly moves to a discussion of regulatory reform and better regulation. And then subsequently we see more and more mention of regulatory management or regulatory policy. And most recently the terms regulatory governance and evidence-based regulation have been those that are widely used to describe what it is that we're doing and attempting to achieve. So this terminological movement obviously reflects the change in the way we conceptualise the issue of better regulation. Initially, the move was from a quantitative to a qualitative focus. Rather than seeing the problem wholly as there being too much regulation and the solution as being to reduce the number of regulations, the focus moved toward regulatory quality, toward opportunities to enhance the benefits that regulation confers, as well as to reduce the costs that it imposes. Increasingly too, reform came to be seen as something that was a permanent function of government. Initially, I think it was conceptualised as something to be done once, or perhaps on an episodic basis, that we had a stock of regulation that was substandard, that we could review it and reform it, and then our work would be done. Increasingly, governments understand that regulatory reform is a task that they need to keep at. It is a permanent role of government. Again, the focus was initially on the stocks of regulation and how we could improve those, but over time the focus increasingly shifted to supplementing that by implementing quality assurance mechanisms that would be applied to flows of new regulation. And those quality assurance concepts tended to broaden over time. So beyond the initial ideas of effectiveness and efficiency, we came to be more concerned with ideas like legitimacy and transparency and accountability. So better regulation is essentially about improving government effectiveness, and so it's obviously very closely aligned with the theme of this week's conference. The underlying goal, as I've said, is welfare maximisation, and that goal implies the primacy of benefit cost analysis as a tool to determine what constitutes a better regulatory outcome. If we think about the broad scope of the task, it also implies the need for strong strategic guidance if we're going to achieve wide-ranging reform, and it also suggests the centrality of good process in driving reform outcomes. So we can ask how important within the broader scope of government activity is better regulation. Now, regulation, I think we all understand, is one of the most widely used tools of government, but we perhaps don't always appreciate just how widely used it is and what the scale of the costs that are imposed by regulation are. In the US, the Small Business Administration recently estimated that the annual cost of compliance with regulation in that country was around $1.75 trillion. And they pointed out that this was 50% larger than the total of all income tax collections in the US. So quite clearly, even small proportionate gains in terms of regulatory cost reductions or even benefit increases are going to yield significant payoffs when considered in absolute terms. Now that obviously raises the question, have we actually realised the gains that have been sought through this better regulation program? And again, as the OECD points out, a lot of the initial expectations were not met. There was perhaps a sense that the task was going to be easier than it's ultimately proven to be. And it's also important to note that there are no global measures of the benefits from better reform, better regulation programs. But it's important in that context not to underestimate the gains that have been achieved. And I'd like to just go through a couple of indicators of those benefits. The OECD, since 1998, has developed and maintained a set of product market indicators. And what they attempt to do is to measure the extent of regulatory restrictions on the operation of product markets. And looking at the results of that set of indicators over that period of around 16 years now, they see significant reductions overall in the restrictiveness of economic regulation over the period in a wide range of OECD member countries. They've also found that there is a strong statistical correlation between the degree of restriction in those product markets and overall economic performance. And that statistical correlation can be seen both cross-sectionally between countries and looking over time across many of the same countries. In Australia, of course, one of the larger better regulation initiatives we've implemented was the legislative review program conducted under the auspices of the National Competition Policy. And as you may know, the Productivity Commission undertook an assessment of that program and suggested that the available benefits from reform were somewhere in the range of 2.5% to 5.5% of GDP. Very substantial gains. The OECD country review program shows us that in a number of countries, and Korea and Mexico are particularly notable in this regard, the government response to major economic crisis has been to adopt a major regulatory reform program. I worked on a country review of Korea soon after the Asian financial crisis, and one of their responses involved halving the quantity of regulation on their statute books over a period of only 2 years. So better regulation is an idea that's been rapidly disseminated. 20 years ago, if we look at regulatory impact assessment, there were only a few OECD countries using this tool. We now find that it's almost universal in the OECD and that it's increasingly widely used beyond the OECD's confines. The number of studies into the effectiveness of impact assessment is unfortunately quite small, but those that have been conducted tend to show that around 20 to 40% of regulatory proposals are changed and improved during the course of the impact assessment process. And a small study I recently completed in Victoria found that even after the publication of the RIS, at least 40% of regulatory proposals were further changed before they were finalised and adopted. It's also important to note that in this area there are likely to be quite important hidden impacts, in the sense that awareness of this hurdle that must be crossed in terms of benefit cost assessment means that there are many proposals that perhaps never reach first base. I'd also suggest that cultural impacts are important. In talking to my clients among regulators in Victoria and federally, it's clear that many of them increasingly see better regulation tools as being something that can help them to achieve their goals, rather than as simply representing a compliance exercise. So there are some positives, but I'd like to point to some risks and continuing problems. One of these is, I think, a persistent tendency, both in government and in industry, to see better regulation through a narrow prism of deregulation and cutting red tape. And I think this points to a long-term tension between views of better regulation as being, as I suggested a moment ago, a means of improving economic welfare on the one hand, and as being an arm of industry policy on the other. And I'd suggest since the GFC, we've seen something of a resurgence in the second view, better regulation as industry policy. A quick scan of the landscape in Australia and taking in a couple of similar countries. Since 2007, we've had a minister, or more recently a parliamentary secretary for deregulation, and an office of deregulation in the Prime Minister's Department. This is the first time ever in the history of Australia we've had that. We have twice annual repeal days initiatives, as you heard yesterday. We have a 20% red tape reduction target federally, and very similar targets in a number of the states. And that reflects the approach of the standard cost model network, which has been in place for some years now and involves more than 20 countries, mostly in Europe. New South Wales recently adopted a one-in, two-out policy, something that was previously implemented in 2011 in the United Kingdom and has also been adopted in Canada. This is an attempt to actually cap total regulatory costs by requiring that whenever a new regulation is proposed, the costs that it imposes must be offset by changes to or the removal of other existing regulations within the same portfolio area. So what's the problem with this sort of movement? Obviously, reducing regulatory costs is a worthy goal. But my suggestion is that when we formulate our issue in terms of deregulation and cutting red tape, there's a risk that the benefit side of the ledger is ignored, that the use of benefit cost analysis is downplayed, and that economic welfare may not, therefore, be improved as a result of the changes that we make. To give an example, the recent repeal day included an announcement that the total benefits in terms of reduced regulatory costs would be around $700 million per annum. But if we look more closely, we see that the largest single contributor to that was the partial reversal of some of the changes on the Future of Financial Advice regulation. That contributed about $200 million. When I read the regulatory impact assessment in relation to those changes, I saw that there was no assessment of the benefits foregone by making that change. And the result of that, without judging the outcome in any way, I can simply observe that it's not therefore possible to show that the result is better in the sense of economic welfare, or to what extent. Other concerns include the fact that a focus on cost reduction inevitably narrows our agenda and thus is likely to reduce the total dividend to our better regulation efforts. I'm also concerned that it implies some risk to the sustainability of the better regulation agenda. If we pursue better regulation essentially as an arm of industry policy, we risk alienating much of the potential constituency for regulatory reform. And given that there's always a need for strong political support in order to achieve successful reform, this is, I'd argue, a substantial risk. Another issue that I see is that there is increasingly a focus on achieving quantitative targets at the expense of highlighting strategic approaches to achieving the outcomes we want. If we look at the one-in, one-out policy I mentioned, I'd suggest that there's a contestable presumption underlying it that less is necessarily better. And if I can refer you to some American data again, the Office of Management and Budget is required annually to report the total benefits and costs of new regulation adopted that year to Congress. If we look at the OMB estimates, they invariably suggest that new regulation confers substantially greater benefits than costs, and Cass Sunstein, in fact, made that point a little earlier. The most recent assessment suggests that benefit-cost ratios overall average around 4:1 to 8:1, and so that inevitably raises the question of the basis on which we want to limit further regulatory action. More importantly, perhaps, this policy also arguably lacks a benefit-cost analysis perspective. Costs are required to be equalised, and we assume that regulators are going to optimise in terms of what they add and what they subtract in the regulatory space. But the question is, well, optimise according to what sort of a utility function? If we look at the summary reports that the UK government has published, they include no assessment in the changes in regulatory benefits as a result of the regulatory changes that have been made. There's also a worry, particularly in the one-in, two-out variant of this policy, that we could have a freezing effect on regulation. If regulators have to achieve reductions in costs of twice any new costs that they impose, the outcome is potentially quite negative from their perspective, quite unattractive, and it's possible that we'll see a slowing in the rate of regulatory change. And given that we need to continue to update regulation to respond to changes in economic and social environments, that can mean that we compromise regulatory quality in a dynamic sense. There are also compliance issues. If you look more closely at what's reported, you see that many of the claimed cost reductions are not actually reductions in regulatory compliance costs. They are in fact transfers. And in fact, the largest single one involved a reduction in the indexation rate of pensions, which meant that it was a transfer from former employees to employers. If I turn briefly to administrative burden reduction programs, these have often been criticised on the grounds that they divert regulatory reform resources and expertise, which are inherently scarce, to the pursuit of gains that are relatively small. Administrative burdens are generally understood to represent only a small minority of regulatory costs. And in fact, in a recent speech, Professor Hilmer estimated that if we were able to eliminate all unnecessary red tape, the gain that we made would be unlikely to exceed 0.29% of GDP. So there's a lot of effort moving toward pursuit of a goal that may not achieve so very much. Another problem with these policies is that they set up a global target, but generally provide no strategic guidance as to how to achieve those reductions most effectively. What are the characteristics of less administratively burdensome regulation is the question that's not answered. So what do we need to do to address some of these risks? Well, I'd argue that we need to ensure that there's a clear policy focus on the idea of better regulation as a means of maximising welfare. And that means making sure that benefit cost analysis is returned to centre stage in relation to all of these initiatives. And very importantly, we need to make sure that we're providing strategic guidance on the characteristics of better regulation. And if I can give you an example there, I mentioned the very successful legislative review program under national competition policy. While that was a successful program, again, it could be said that there was no central guidance on how to go about removing significant regulatory restrictions. Since that program was completed, the OECD has published what it calls a competition assessment toolkit. And what that tries to do is to identify why we often see regulatory restrictions on competition. What are the underlying objectives that regulators are seeking to achieve? And it then goes through and proposes different means of achieving those same public policy objectives, which are less restrictive of competition. So it's intended to be a practical guide for regulators as to how to achieve those kinds of goals that we pursued through the NCP legislative review. I'd also suggest that we need to focus more on the latter stages of the regulatory cycle, on implementation and enforcement, and particularly on undertaking systemic ex post reviews. So if we did all these things, how would they apply to the initiatives that I've highlighted? I'd just like to give you a practical sense of what this would mean in practice. If we applied those principles to one-in, one-out programs, we'd have a requirement to show that there was in fact an increase in net benefits due to the regulatory substitutions we'd made. And we'd have some clearer rules about accounting for the different costs, the transfers being clearly separated from the real regulatory cost changes. But importantly, we'd also have some strategic guidance on achieving those regulatory cost reductions. We could do that by our experts, our Office of Best Practice Regulation or the Productivity Commission, publishing such guidance. We could propose community of practice initiatives among regulators to help with wider dissemination of good practice. If we look at administrative burden reduction, again, I'd say providing that guidance on how you can reduce administrative burdens, on what has been successful, what is likely to be productive, is fundamental. But if we adopt that approach, it might also lead us to replacing these arbitrary targets, let's have a 20% reduction, with an assessment against qualitative indicators that are actually based on the content of that guidance. And I'd suggest we also need to integrate this process with regulatory impact assessment in order to streamline it and reduce its costs. Finally, if we're going to pursue deregulation, again, I think we need to be clear about what strategic approaches we're actually proposing. And there are a few options in this space. Are we saying deregulation means reducing regulatory stringency? If that's what we mean, perhaps what we should be looking at is systematically promoting more quantitative risk assessment so that we can ensure standard setting reflects an understanding of marginal benefit and cost trade-offs. Perhaps this also involves accepting the concept of acceptable risk and setting acceptable risk thresholds, as was done in the UK around a decade ago following Tony Blair's comments and lobbying on this issue. We could mean, by deregulation, reducing complexity. Murray Sherman has made the point that complexity is, in some senses, a drafting choice, and it may not improve regulatory performance. So perhaps we need to provide guidance to regulators on that issue. And finally, maybe deregulation means reducing the scope of regulation. We rarely hear proposals in this area, but to give you an example of the possible, perhaps, we're about to see the demise of the Australian car manufacturing industry. Might this be a good time to wonder whether we still need country-specific vehicle safety standards and all of the compliance and enforcement infrastructure that goes along with that? Might we not instead rely on US or European standards? So in conclusion, I'd say the better regulation agenda is a broad one. It has achieved much in a range of areas. It certainly can be a major contributor to more effective government, but making sure we achieve the potential of this policy requires us to ensure that we pursue all aspects of the better regulation agenda and that action is based on a strategic implementation of insights about what are the characteristics of high quality regulation. Thank you.